For those of you not familiar with Novel Circle, we have been gathering for more than 30 years for coffee and chocolate and a discussion of good fiction or occasionally nonfiction. We learn from stories. We see ourselves in fictional characters and events, and reading fiction gives us the benefit of other people's perspectives that enrich our lives. Novel Circle is open to anyone. We meet the first Wednesday of the month at 7:30 at Founders House, and our selection for August 7th is Peter Tremaine's Absolution by Murder, the first novel in the series that centers around the 7th century superhero, Sister Fidelma of Cashel, sister to the King of Munster, Anna de Lac, trained in the law of Finnichus. Her duties as a de Lac, roughly somewhere between a sheriff and a district attorney, take her far and wide, not just in the British Isles, but to Iberia and Rome. This series of 28 books were written by Peter Tremaine, whose real name is Peter Braresford Ellis. If you are looking for great literature, this isn't it. But if you are looking for an engaging, entertaining, historically grounded understanding of the world of the Celts, there is no better way. If you want to know about Peter Tremaine and his 7th century, green-eyed, red-haired heroine, Google the International Sister Fidelma Society. You will also learn more about her partner, Brother Eodulf, who brings out the softer side of Fidelma. He is also a useful literary device as a person new to Celtic culture, to whom things have to be explained, like hospitality, laws, the legal system, and the way the kings are chosen. So we learn too by eavesdropping on these conversations. The origin of the Celts are surrounded in mystery, but they were well known to the Greeks and Romans and were settled all over Europe from present-day Romania to Ireland, with patches still persisting in Spain, Brittany, and of course the British Isles. The Irish, Scots, and Welsh are predominantly Celtic. They were a sophisticated people in terms of religion, law, and the art of warfare, in which they taught the Romans a few lessons in strategy, tactics, and armaments. They were a seafaring and agricultural people who had converted to Christianity, but still tolerated the old faith and observed the seasonal holidays. The series opens at the Council of Whitby, a confrontation between the Roman Church and the Celtic Church. Supposedly, the synod was to resolve differences over the date of Easter and the tonsures of the monks. But those were only the tip of the iceberg of a clash of cultures. Sister Fidelma is present as a legal advisor to her abbess and meets the Anglo-Saxon brother Eodulf as her Roman counterpart. Together, they solve their first mystery, and over time, they become a couple, as well as a sleuthing partnership. Those of us who are fans of the series have found important lessons on culture. We who are descended from Western European immigrants are heirs to the Celts, as well as the Greeks and Romans and the Jews, but their cultures are very different. Perhaps we can learn from the Celts a kinder, gentler way of being in the world than suffering the hardships of the Jews or being subject to the imperialism of the conquering Romans.
Kinship and ancestry were very important to the Celts. It was how you knew who you were and knew whether someone was a friend, maybe not a friend, or an outright foe. So ancient Ireland was composed of 5 separate counties or countries, frequently at war with each other. The boundary of this, the boundary of that, and always testing out to see who was really in charge. The small communities that were within Ireland were connected by trails and rivers. So again, take yourself back to a time when the way to get around was on foot or by horseback or by small boat. And that was the way people connected. So Fidelma and her partner, as they traveled throughout her own county and throughout the other counties, had to introduce herself again and again. When she arrived at a simple cottage of a farmer, a cotter, or a tradesman, she would introduce herself and her traveling companions, usually her husband, Adolf, as well as an armed guard. I am Fidelma of Cashel. I am traveling on behalf of my brother, the king. We need directions to the next shelter, or we need a place to stay, or we need information. So that was the more casual kind of introduction. But just as we introduce ourselves, as we have at the beginning of the service, I am Liz Branstead, and I have been here for about 8 years. I am Fidelma of Cashel. The bit of humor that comes in constantly is as she introduces her husband, and they say, well, you are a Saxon, and he always automatically says, no, I'm an Angle. Now, sometimes she needed to say that she was a woman of authority, and so then she would step it up a little. I am Fidelma of Cashel. My brother Kolgu is the king, and I am a Dale, a lawyer with a rank just below the Supreme Brehon, or the Chief Justice of this land. I have the authority given by the king and my training to investigate and resolve issues. Now, tell me the truth. And if she needed to prove who she was, she carried a rowan wand with the insignia of the kingdom. Now, as I have said, it was important to know the lineage. And sometimes she would go to great lengths to say the lineage and the right of her brother to be king of this country. Neither king nor chieftain can be installed in this ancestry without this ancestry being sung before the assembly. Kolgu, my brother and the king, is the 59th generation of Eber Finn, the son of Mild and the founder of this southern kingdom. It was the 8 sons of Mild the warrior, whose birth name was Golam, who landed with the Giles on the shore of this island and established themselves here. And that was in the time beyond time when they had to fight with the ancient gods and demons. And my brother, the king, is now king.
Sister Fidelma was technically a nun at the start of the series, but she didn't stay that way very long because, as you know, she was also the sister of the King of Munster, and she was frankly more interested in law than religion, having studied law for 8 years. The only reason she took religious vows is because there was an abbey in need of a lawyer to manage its legal affairs, and a lawyer needs a job, so she became Sister Fidelma. But several volumes into the series, after catching the abbess in covering up some rather dastardly deeds, she parted company from her order, discarded her nunly habit, and dressed like the Irish princess and legal scholar that was her alter ego. And she also married the patient and long-suffering brother Adolf, first with a trial marriage, and then after she decided he was okay, she agreed to a permanent marriage, although they could divorce if they wanted to. Ireland had been at least nominally converted to the new faith, also known as Christianity, in the 5th century by St. Patrick and others, but vestiges of the old faith were still observed by many, including Christians. Those vestiges reflected a rich oral tradition, including the Druids and the goddess in her 3 roles as maiden, mother, and crone, and the sun king born at the solstice each year, worship in oak groves, leprechauns, the wheel of the year, all those good things, Beltane and Samhain and Imbolc and Lammas. It was an agricultural society, unlike Rome, and nature was important to their daily lives, religious as well as secular. So Celtic or Irish Christianity was not Roman Christianity because Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire. Celtic Christianity was a kinder, gentler, more tolerant, more nature-centered version of the Christian faith. Pelagius was a 4th century Irish monk and theologian who challenged Augustine, that baleful and misogynist architect of the worst parts of Christian theology. Augustine believed in hierarchical authority. He was a misogynist, didn't care much for women, and gave us those two lovely doctrines, original sin and predestination. Pelagius begged to differ, and even today he's noted as a heretic, even in Christian seminaries. I had to fight for him in my seminary days. Well, not long after the days of the fictional sister Fidelma in the 7th century, another Irish theologian advanced the work of Pelagius in challenging the Catholic faith. His name was, I think this is a cool name, John Scotus Eriugena, which translates into John the Scot born in Ireland. But it was a good heresy. I've always liked heresies. This is a particular favorite of mine. Free will, original blessing rather than original sin, all those good things. Well, in the first book in this series, Absolution by Murder, as you know, they went to the Synod at Whitby in Britain, which was supposed to resolve differences in between the Irish and the Roman Church. Now, for centuries, the Catholic Church has said, it was just all about the date of Easter and the way the monks do their tonsure. That's all it was about. But actually not. The Irish had co-houses, adjacent abbeys for men and women, one with an abbot, one with an abbess. Monks and nuns were free to marry and raise their children in the faith. The role of women, the pressure for priestly celibacy, the hierarchy of authority, the ability of the church to punish people for their sins, and intolerance for the old faith, these were pretty significant differences in matching culture to faith. The Romans persuaded King Oswald to favor them and carried the day, which resulted in stifling many of these admirable Celtic and specifically Irish practices. So what is our heritage as a faith tradition for this particular undercurrent that challenged the dominant Roman faith? Original blessing instead of original sin, equality of the sexes in religion and elsewhere, a closeness to the natural world and the cycle of the seasons, and if not religious democracy, at least locating religious authority with less uniformity and more freedom to explore. I know it sounds like I have just converted Sister Fidelma to Unitarian Universalism. But these novels do bring back that world to life and add to the richness of our shared religious heritage.
Celtic women. According to author Peter Tremaine, Sister Fidelma is not just a nun, a member of what we now call the Celtic Church. She is a skilled professional whose voice was heeded by men of the church in both Rome and the British Isles. The conflict between the Celtic Church and Rome on matters of theology and social governance are well known. Apart from differences in rituals, the date of Easter and the way monks did their tonsures, celibacy was not widely practiced among the Celts, and many religious houses included both sexes who raised children to the service of God. Irish women could be co-equal with men in professions, including lawyers and judges, druids, poets, doctors, and musicians. There were even women rulers like Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, who took on the Romans and defeated them several times in battle before finally losing the final battle and taking poison. Her complaint? In a battle over whether she could rule after her husband's death, she was quoted by a Roman writer as saying, "I take the field like my ordinary citizen among you, to assert the cause of liberty, to seek justice for my body, scarred with the Roman lash, and to avenge my raped daughters. From the pride and arrogance of Rome, nothing is sacred. All are subject to violation. The old endure the whip, and the young girls are raped." The mighty Romans were seldom a match for the Celts in battle. The Celts had better weapons and were fierce warriors. While Ireland eventually succumbed to the Roman Catholic Church more or less, it was never part of the Roman Empire. One Roman wrote this about Celtic women: "A whole troop of foreigners would not be able to withstand a single Celt if he called his wife to his assistance. The wife is even more formidable. She is usually very strong. In a rage, her neck veins swell. She gnashes her teeth and brandishes her snow-white, robust arms. She begins to strike blows, mingled with kicks, as if there were so many missiles sent from the string of a catapult. The voices of these women are formidable and threatening, even when they are not angry but being friendly. But all Celtic women with equal care keep neat and clean, and in some areas, such among the Aquitani, no woman can be seen, be she ever so poor, in soiled or ragged clothing. Brother Eudolf only reluctantly gave in to the Irish custom of bathing each afternoon in a hot tub with soaps and lotions, not a common practice among the British or Romans. While there were some constraints on women's legal rights, Celtic women were surprisingly liberated in the choices they made at the age of consent, which was 14 for women and 17 for men. They could enter a convent or get married to the man of their choice, with the option of a trial marriage first, and divorce fairly easy for either husband or wife to initiate. They could be rulers like Boudicca, because the kingship or queenship did not automatically go to the eldest son, a practice that the British just gave up a couple of years ago. In fact, it required a family conference representing at least 3 generations present to decide who was best suited for the leadership and who should be the king or queen in waiting to succeed to the throne. Very democratic for the early Middle Ages. Women could study for a profession or take up an occupation that may have belonged in the family: farming, cheese making, sewing, running a public house. For the poorer classes, there were opportunities to be warriors, servants, or other occupations. Women were also protected against sexual harassment, discrimination, and rape. They could inherit property and share in the family assets after divorce. Romans' treatment of women was much more patriarchal. The authority of the male head of the family was absolute, and the women were largely confined to their homes in both Greece and Rome. So while our ancestral European cultures may have improved on Rome, it was only that after a 72-year struggle for the right to vote that brought American women in 1920 even close to the freedom, opportunity, and respect enjoyed by a 7th century woman in the Celtic world.
So you're getting a feel for ancient Ireland, for the culture, for the women, for the religion. They also socialized a lot, but it was also very narrow. As I said earlier, these are very small towns, maybe 1 or 2 homes together, maybe a small village, and the way they got around was always by foot, by horse. Hospitality was essential. And by hospitality, it was how you were greeted as you came into a simple farm or into a community. So Fidelma and her husband Eudolf, and usually a guard, frequently traveled together. They traveled usually on horseback through friendly towns, as well as into regions that were at war or in highly contested areas. When they arrived at a farmer's cottage or a ferryman's crossing or a tradesman, it was expected that the traveler would be offered food, water for the horses, and some comfort. No one was ever turned away. It was a long distance between farmers' homes, and a guest must always be welcome. Ideally, they traveled together. They gauged their travel so they could arrive at an abbey or a monastery, a slightly larger settlement. The gates to the abbey stood open, and they rode their horses through into a large square. A tall, burly man of the brethren strode toward them with a smile. "You are most welcome, pilgrims. I am Brother Lugadna, the abbey's master of the stables. How can I serve you?" When arriving at a monastery, or a lord of the land, it was expected that the abbot or the master would welcome the travelers, take care of their horses, serve them meals, and provide sleeping arrangements. It was the custom for travelers, indeed for everyone, to have a full hot bath before dinner. A servant took them to the bathing area, provided hot water and towels, and afterwards they awaited the bell, signaling a meal, and then joined the ruler or the abbot. Furthermore, if they arrived at a lord's manor or castle, it was expected that Fidelma would be seated in the dais next to the lord and offer choice cuts of meat or wine or beer. She did not bow to anyone.
And our last reflection is on something very close to our hearts, which is justice, which is appropriate since Sister Fidelma was basically a trained lawyer. It was about 150 years ago that women were finally admitted to the bar after multiple court cases in the United States. So Sister Fidelma is something of a legal superhero who pursues truth, justice, and the Irish way through some 28 volumes. Now, the Celtic understanding of justice was quite different from justice under both Roman and American law. Now, one important difference between the Celts and the Romans is the Romans practiced slavery, the Irish did not. They did have indentured servants, but that's different from slavery in perpetuity. But the really amazing difference was that among the Irish, there was no difference between criminal and civil offenses. Criminal justice is about punishment. It's also known as retributive justice. You put people in prison, you flog them, you fine them, you execute them. In ancient Ireland and elsewhere in the Celtic world, there were no victimless crimes like possession of marijuana, driving while black, selling alcohol to a minor, things like that. The courts were called in when someone's person or property was harmed by another, or, as Liz just mentioned, if he or she has failed to observe the requirements of hospitality, which include aid to the injured. That is, you had a legal obligation to be a good Samaritan if you encountered somebody, as well as providing for the wayfarer. So once the courts determined, or the lawyers determined the responsibility, the perp was not punished as he would be under criminal law. Instead, he or she owed restitution to the victim. The amount was measured in kumals, or milk cows. We would probably use something else today. And it depended on the status of the victim and the severity of the harm. And it fell to the perpetrator and his kinfolk to pay the price. If they couldn't do so, then the guy who did it, or the gal, had to work for the victim until they determined the debt had been repaid. And that's where some of the indentured servants came from. Now think of the implications if we had that system today. We do follow a similar practice in civil law in terms of restitution, but it's not like the Irish law, which says, well, this person is a warrior and therefore his life is worth so many kumals, and so this is what you owe. It's whatever the jury decides is fair in both class action lawsuits and civil lawsuits, and juries in the United States can add punitive damages, which also pay to the defendant. So if you're part of an opioids case or something, you may be seeing punitive damages. But revenge or retribution was not part of their understanding of justice. Right now in American society, there are debates about the reparations for descendants of slaves and restoration of land and rights to Native Americans. Native Americans have a really strong case because it's grounded in broken treaties from legal terms, although both have a moral claim. Few of the freed blacks after the Civil War ever got their promised 40 acres and a mule, and in fact, the federal government paid compensation to former slave owners for the loss of their slaves. So there hasn't been much in the way of reparations, affirmative action, school integration, support for historically black colleges. On the other hand, we can score a few democracy points compared to Fidelma's world because the amount paid in civil suits is supposed to reflect the harm done, regardless of whether the victim was a farmer or a king, or in our world, a garbage collector or a corporate executive. But given the brokenness of our legal system in terms of incarceration and the extensive use of punitive practices, Sister Fidelma's kind of justice gives us a lot to think about.